Do you believe these 3 cold water bass fishing myths that I believed for years? I used to hate fishing in the wintertime because I thought you always just had to fish really slow. Cast it out there, let it set on the bottom, and just slowly bring it back. I never thought that you could cast it out and reel it fast and actually catch fish in the wintertime. But after a recent trip to the pond with my daughter, I realized that simply wasn't the case. You see, I was casting out into the pond, slowly reeling it back and not getting a single bite. Then I was like, well, what the heck do I have to lose? So I decided to cast it out and reel it back a little bit faster. And wouldn't you have it, literally the very first time that I did that, I had a bite. Cast it back out there, kept reeling faster, and I ended up catching several fish that day simply because I sped up my retrieve and I ignored the myth that you always have to fish slow in the wintertime. So after my recent trip with my daughter to the pond, I consider that myth busted. You don't always have to fish slow when the water is cold. I thrive on shallow water fishing. When the bass are shallow, I feel like I can catch all of them. And that's why I hated fishing in the wintertime. The water was cold and I just assumed that they all went deep. They all went way out away from the bank and I just could not catch them. However, on that same trip that I went to the pond with my daughter in, we'd actually experienced a slight warming trend on the days leading up to that trip, which meant the water in the shallow spots was a little bit warmer, but I didn't consider this. So I started casting out into the middle and I told my daughter to do the same. And we weren't getting any bites. And then just for the heck of it, I was like, I'll cast right down the bank where it's really shallow. And sure enough, I got a hit the first cast. So I kept doing this and caught another one. And that's when I told my daughter, hey, I think I'm onto something. Try casting a little bit shallower. Don't go to the deepest part of the pond. And she ended up catching a fish. Now, there were other factors that went into this, but it goes to show you that fish don't always go deep in the wintertime. Sometimes you can find them shallow. So I consider this myth busted. You don't always have to go deep to catch bass in the cold water. You can call it nostalgia or whatever you want, but I still prefer to fish from a kayak or a boat, probably because that's what I grew up doing. So when I see all these guys putting out winter fishing tips, they always have to do with a boat, dialing in your electronics, finding fish on a certain area of the lake, and you need a boat to get there. And I have no desire to go out and buy an expensive bass boat and put several more $1,000s worth of electronics on that boat. And yes, it's made it tougher on me for catching fish in the wintertime, but I can still catch them from the bank. Like I said, they're still in the shallows at times. So you don't always have to have a fancy bass boat to catch bass in cold water. So I'd consider that myth busted. You don't always have to have a fancy boat with fancy electronics to catch bass in cold water. You can go fishing on fishing docks. You can walk down the bank and go fishing in a lot of places. There's more ways to catch bass than just using a bass boat. Now, there is a caveat to all of these myths. Sometimes they're true. They're more like half-truths. There's times when, yes, you do have to slow down and fish really slow. That's the beauty of fishing, is because it's not a science. It's more of an art form. You've got to figure out what the fish want for that day at that time. Even throughout the day, they'll change their minds. For instance, in the morning, you might be catching them fishing really slow at a dock, and then all of a sudden they just stop biting. So you move on down the bank a little bit and speed up your retrieve and start catching them again. So now that you've learned these busted myths, you need to know some winter bass fishing tips, which I've linked that video right below me, and I can't wait to see you there.